Thank you all for joining my paper highlighting the human hand in planting gardens by the bay. This paper highlights the human hand in creating gardens. Hands are always present in gardens, but at different moments in time, the presence of human intervention in the construction of orchestrated plant life might be highlighted or hidden. The classic opposition is between the French garden of order, like the Versailles gardens, which highlight the human hand, and the picturesque English gardens of liberty, which hide it, for example. Garden fashions change over time on this continuum of visible human versus planty agency. The park next to my home in Toronto, High Park, originally had more orchestrated gardens, but in recent decades has opted for letting much of the park, they're subordinating themselves to planty agency and allowing the native grasses and flowers to return. In Singapore's Gardens by the Bay, however, human hands and human technology are starring figures. The 18th century English gardener, William Kent, was famous for getting rid of the garden wall, setting boundaries instead by perimeter ditches in order to allow the garden to leap the actual perimeter to incorporate the borrowed scenery of nature beyond it, to see all nature as a garden, as Walpole nicely puts it. The gardens by the bay, however, are not only strongly delimited themselves, but also define the new perimeter of Singapore, situated as they are on reclaimed land on Singapore's shoreline. Okay, so this is the map of the gardens by the bay. Okay, so with two enormous greenhouses, which you can see here, and 18 super trees, which you can see, those little round things are the super trees, which are 25 to 50 meters in height. Gardens by the Bay have been the signature image of Singapore's skyline since it opened in 2012. One doesn't even have to visit the gardens themselves to feel their visual presence. And this much photographed destination has become iconic of Singapore itself, represented in myriad government documents and tourism promotion documents. The Gardens by the Bay got lots of attention when it was featured in the film Crazy Rich Asians in 2018, providing the backdrop for the controversial wedding that was at the center of the plot. And should you wish to quit your day job and become an influencer, you can follow bloggers who will tell you where to take selfies, where the key scenes were filmed. Selfie taking is very big in Singapore as well as other places in the world. Literature scholar Joanne Liao argues that Gardens by the Bay, via this movie, indicate how the dangers of the tropics have been contained, micromanaged, and translated into spectacle for capitalist consumption. And the Gardens by the Bay is kind of an immaculate display case for nature. It was expensive to build, $1 billion Singapore dollars, which are roughly equivalent with Canadian dollars, if anyone knows what that means, less strong than the American dollar. And they cost $50 million a year to maintain. And according to some, it captures the current ethos of Singapore. The following quote is from the Gardens by the Bay website. Gardens by the Bay brings to life the National Parks Board Singapore's vision of creating a city in a garden. The gardens capture the essence of Singapore as a premier tropical garden city with the perfect environment in which to live and work, making Singapore a leading global city of the 21st century. And not only does it provide a new edge to Singapore's new land, but it also claims itself as somehow its essence, which is an interesting statement. The Gardens by the Bay have generated much discussion, and much of it negative, particularly through scholars who don't actually spend that much time in Singapore. Some call them an Edenic apocalypse, and I will take up this point later in the paper. For now, I will merely note one uncontested point, that it is very much a limiting case of nature contained with technology. However, its claims about how this combination of nature and technology can produce an eco-friendly environment is more up for debate. While the Singapore Botanic Gardens, which I discussed last week, is open to all free of charge, except for the orchid garden where you pay $5 to enter, one must pay to enter the flower dome, the cloud forest, and the Supertree observatory. So all three of these might cost $73 for non-residents and $49 for residents. So it's different. So this is an interior shot of the flower dome. In a reversal of what one found in Europe, where greenhouses were the home of tropical plants, in Singapore we find the plants of Europe given shelter in the tropics. A plaque on the Supertree elevated walkway, which can be accessed for an additional $14, describes them as two amazing, innovative, energy-efficient cooled conservatories. They turn the concept of greenhouse on its head, making it possible to grow cool-growing plants in a tropical climate. And a few visitors noted to me that they found it very odd to find plants like olive trees, which are so much of the outdoor landscape of much of the Mediterranean, in the greenhouse. The flower dome, so the flower dome, which won the Guinness Book of World Records for 2015 for having the world's largest glass greenhouse, is described as the equivalent of 75 Olympic-style swimming pools, or 1.2 hectares. The flower dome is one of these signature greenhouses, a cool house. Now, while the Gardens by the Bay claim the cool house as their own unique invention, those scholars at the Singapore Botanic Gardens claim that it was invented there. Also noted on their webpage is that they have glass that allows optimal light in for plants while minimizing solar heat, allowing the conservatory to be cooled more efficiently. The temperature has to be kept between 23 and 25 Celsius to allow the survival of many of these foreign plants in Singapore's heat and humidity. And it can get pretty hot, at least 35, and very, very humid. The flower dome features areas divided by climatic zones like the Mediterranean or Africa, or by plant type. For instance, they have an expansive succulent and cactus collection, and they also have my favorite plant, olive trees. So this is a view from looking down over onto the floral dome. This is an olive tree. These are two of my favorite kinds of weird succulents. These collections are permanent, but there's also a space on the main floor to celebrate yearly events. So, for instance, in honor of Chinese New Year's this year, celebrating the Year of the Horse, in January 2026, they had a special flower collection with elegant Chinese blooms and representations of horses, because it was the Year of the Horse. And this was thought to, help the celebration of Chinese New Year's, which virtually took over the city. And as extravagant as it is in size, the flower dome is perfectly comprehensible to those familiar and fond of greenhouses, which allow one to engage with plants from other parts of the world without leaving your home base. The cloud forest, when one enters the cloud forest, one is greeted by an astounding 35, this is from the outside, a 35-meter tall waterfall spewing forth from a 42-meter tall man-made cloud mountain. One is immediately covered in mist. The idea is to create an indoor rainforest. My first impression when I visited for the first time in 2017 was one of stunned amazement. While such fakitude is not really my aesthetic style, it was impressive what with the massive waterfalls and various elevated walkways which provided an amazing view of Singapore's skylines. The walkways allow one to view the plants below, but also, just hold on, but also allow one to look out onto the ocean, which is peppered with container ships, indicating Singapore's continuing role as a key port city. From 2022 to 2024, the cloud forest also featured displays from the movie Avatar. I kind of missed the Avatar movie craze. I don't know if anyone else. I tried to watch it on a plane one time and fell asleep, but it was quite popular. But when I returned in January 2026, the Avatar display had been replaced with a Jurassic Park display, complete with fake dinosaurs. So when you walk into the cloud forest, you see these dinosaurs. So you get the sense when you're walking on the elevated high walkways, you see the mist and also more fake dinos. And while there were some plaques trying to be informative about plants at the time of the dinosaur, or plants like ferns that appear in ancient geologic time but are still with us in the present. What stood out for me was the Hollywooding of the plant context. The startling sounds one hears, so this is your entrance to Jurassic World, and the startling sounds, this is also the Jeep from Jurassic Park, which was kind of stuffed into one of the plant displays here. But these dinosaurs, the heads move, and they also emit this sound to mimic dinosaur sounds, or what we've imagined dinosaur sounds to be like, thanks to movies like Jurassic Park, as these extinct animals very much live on in cultural imaginaries. As I was reading the plaque, I kept sort of jumping with a start when a fake dinosaur brayed behind me, but there are certain things one does for the sake of research. But I honestly felt like I needed a 2-year-old to provide cover for being there at all. And so I asked a Botanic garden official about the invasion of the dinosaurs into the cloud forest. And she said that she had heard they'd taken a big financial hit during COVID when it was temporarily shut to visitors. And as I said before, it's quite expensive to maintain. As they are no longer under the umbrella of the National Parks Board, the corporation which now runs Gardens by the Bay uses these alliances with film studios to offset the costs for the infrastructures of these cool houses. So, proudly engineered, that's my dino with moving head. Not only does the Gardens by the Bay trumpet their technological innovations in cooling, but they also note that the garden itself is built on fake ground, what is described as reclaimed land. It is common enough to use the phrase land reclamation for what is essentially land creation, but Charmaine Chua shows the seedy underbelly of this practice as well as its colonial roots. In a piece published in the Funambulist, a publication which adds political critique to landscape design and architecture, she argues, until recently, territory has been largely regarded as the unassailable material limit of sovereignty. To rule in the modern conception is to have authority over bounded space, to exercise control over a people within the seemingly permanent features of landed territory. Of course, rulers have long sought to expand the zones of operation through which they could exercise their power, shifting borders and boundaries of rule through acts of bloody conquest and dispossession. But what if today, rather than taking over existing territory, one can literally create it? And Chua, of course, is talking about the centrality of land to colonialism. The colonist moves in to take over the land. She argues, however, that Singapore is continuing with a colonialist pattern with a twist. Instead of taking over the land of another country, they are taking the sand. And she poses the following rather disturbing question. What if land, rather than being an immovable geological fact, is actually a mobile commodity, conjured through an accretion of the most granular forms, sand? Chua traces where the material comes from to build this new section of Singapore. Soil was extracted from many of Singapore's existing hills, but that was not really nearly enough, so sand was imported from its neighbors. Until 2007, most of the sand came from Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia. It was halted after reports that sand extraction had caused landslides as well as damage to the marine ecologies. Subsequently, most of the sand since 2007 has come from Cambodia and Myanmar. This conjuring of land from the water, from the sand, extends Singapore's territorial reach. This terraforming project is not a practice which the government seeks to disguise. Rather, it's proudly proclaimed as a process and is on display and accessible for free to Singaporeans and tourists at the Singapore City Gallery at the Urban Redevelopment Authority. So you walk in, and on a table roughly of that height, you see this model made of Singapore as it is now, and also well noted is where the land reclamation has taken place. So it's mostly from here out there. So it's quite a lot. This is described as Singapore's urban planning journey, and it's quite, in some ways it works quite well that you can walk around the whole display, so you're essentially walking around the island. And the old and new parts of Singapore are clearly identified. But never mentioned is where the sand for this terraforming came from. As Chua notes, what is perhaps new about the modern terraforming project is that in transporting sand from neighboring countries, it literally removes territory from them. Rather than doing this through occupation or settlement, however, this theft of land is practically untraceable. Sand from a disappearing island in Indonesia is practically indistinguishable from sand from a seabed off the coast of the Philippines. The hands that designed the gardens by the bay are highlighted. After a competition, the British firm Grant Associates led a consortium of international architects in the design. But Chua also notes that we don't hear about the hands who do the hard manual labor of transporting the sand, constructing the buildings, or tending the plants. The terraforming project began in the 1970s, but the sand and dirt had to be left to settle and stabilize for a few decades until 2007, when the construction started for Gardens by the Bay. Like the construction of Singapore's high-rises and subways, the construction of the Gardens of the Bay was done mostly with temporary laborers who work in the parks themselves now. Chua notes the silence between the past, when many people from whom contemporary Singaporeans are descended came to Singapore originally as temporary workers and are now citizens. So that's the past. The present, the temporary workers are also not citizens, but are not eligible for citizenship. Other Singaporeans have uneasily noted the growing difference between those who are citizens and those who can never become citizens, despite their often ethnic shared heritage. Chua says, "It is in the disposability of these workers' bodies that I hear echoes of the coolies who worked the ports of Singapore during the colonial era. This is a national song, there is a national song which begins with the words, 'We built this nation with our hands, the toil of people from a dozen lands.'" Those lyrics, this is a quote from Chua, those lyrics resurface when I think about the foreign workers who effectively serve as Singapore's fungible coolie labor today. I also thought of the point of when I read on the Gardens by the Bay website that the structure is enclosed by exactly 3,332 individual glass panels. One time when I paid the extra money to visit the high walkway that connects some of the giant trees, I looked down to notice, I don't know if you can see the man here who's charged with cleaning the windows. So that's an awful lot of labor, and I would imagine you have to have nerves of steel as well. I mean, they are on wires, and the human hands are very visible as they appear on the roof. The Heritage Garden. During an interview at the Singapore Botanic Garden, I asked my interlocutor what she thought of Gardens by the Bay, their garden rival. And so the Singapore Botanic Garden that I talked about last week certainly has more of the scientific cred, the long history of being there since 1859, and housing scholars over the decades of existence. And they still have their publication, Garden-wise, where scholarly articles are published. So the scholar from the Singapore Botanic Garden said that there was no hostility between these two kinds of gardens, noting that initially they had both been under the National Parks Board banner. And the National Parks Board is responsible for the grounds surrounding the Flower Dome, the Cloud Dome, and the Supertrees. But it is now, since 2011, in private ownership. The Gardens by the Bay also features the Heritage Garden, mimicking Singapore's designation of the ethnic composition of its people. So there are 4 gardens: the Malay Garden, the Chinese Garden, the Indian Garden, and the Colonial Garden. As in the Botanic Gardens, we see the tale of the spectacular failure of many of the plantation crops, and the success of the rubber crop is also here. But the display itself is rather different. It's displayed in the Wardian cases, but what you have here are tires covering the Wardian cases. And so the one describing chocolate in Singapore is covered in a chocolate bar, and the one talking about the trajectory of pepper plants has peppercorns embedded in the lid of the Wardian case. When I reported this to her, she started laughing, and she said, "Yeah, the real mission in Gardens of the Bay is infotainment, or edutainment. It's an edutainment garden." Epiphytes and supertrees. As I mentioned last week, the hybrid orchid is Singapore's official national flower, representing the strong but vital interconnections between Singapore's human population, at least ideally. I had originally thought that a perfect plant metaphor for Singapore would be the ubiquitous epiphytes, plants that are not, they're not parasitical, but plants that thrive on trees, various different kinds. They thrive as cohabitants on the same tree. But I asked my Singaporean friend if this would work. Do people talk about epiphytes as representing Singapore? And she said she saw what I meant, but it's so ubiquitous in Singapore to the people who've grown up there that they wouldn't even notice it. So it's kind of like plant blindness, meaning that the plants that stood out for me did not stand out at all for them. And as I sat, humbled that my brilliant anthropological insight had just been shot down, she moved on to discuss the particular role that epiphytes play in the gardens by the bay on the infamous Supertrees. As one can see from the photos, the Supertrees are huge metal structures which plants grow up and on. It is very distinctive, expensive, and kind of monumental set of artificial structures to house nature. One plant says that the Supertrees are inspired by the magnificent eucalyptus trees of Western Australia, and that they also claim that they are an icon of sustainable design. They are a form of vertical garden, and they're ones that are deliberately designed to host epiphytes. So they're mimicking the common living trees ubiquitous to Singapore, who are home to plants that do not have to rely on soil to grow, which I think is quite fascinating. And a plaque in the cloud forest says, "Tear your gaze away from these beautiful plants to the gardens beyond to see thousands more epiphytes perching on the surface of vertical gardens, the Supertrees." And another plant claims, similar to real trees, many of our Supertrees harvest renewable energy through sunlight using photovoltaic panels. So the Supertrees are modeled on the real epiphytic trees that are so common throughout Singapore, especially, and they're popular because they provide very welcome shade in the heat. And I have become a shade worshiper. And certainly in that heat, we all appreciate a little cover from the sun. So many of the bromeliads were acquired from the Mary Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, Florida, where a key figure in Singapore's Botanic Garden, Tan Wee Kiat, had close ties. And he took inspiration from this garden. And so bromeliads are drought-resistant plants that require little soil, and some don't require any soil at all. And most of them are epiphytes that live on real trees without compromising the health of the tree. The bromeliads seem perfect for the Supertree because they can withstand the heat that is particularly strong on the metal structures. The plants on the Supertrees, however, never turned out to be quite as luscious and vibrant as initially imagined. Many of the Supertrees don't have any foliage at all on their outer branches. There are small nutritive pouches attached to the metal frames which provide the necessary sustenance for the plants. But so you can see, these are just some examples. These are they have little sort of, I'm not sure what the porous canvas kind of stuff that provide whatever context the plants need to, that they're not getting from the metal structure. And so they do fairly well on the stem, but not on the outer branches, like the designers thought they would. So ideally, the imaginary was that the Supertrees would provide the same kind of shade as the epiphytic trees, natural trees do, but they never really worked that way. And it was too difficult for workers and dangerous to do the necessary upkeep on the outer reaches of the Supertrees. And some have a bit of foliage on the outer branches, but not nearly enough to produce shade, although some have nice flowers. And you can see the difference between the bottom stem and the outer branches. In a Time Out article entitled 15 Things You Can Do in Singapore That You Can't Do Anywhere Else, Gardens by the Bay was recommended, beginning with the following: no city manicures its natural surroundings quite like Singapore. But don't take our word for it. Make a trip to Gardens by the Bay, a microcosm of Singapore's unique relationship with nature, to have a look for yourself. The futuristic-looking sculptures are the centerpieces in this horticultural oasis. These are solar-powered super trees that light up at night. The nightlight show is a huge draw, especially for the cruise ship types. But the shows are usually quite well attended. Even on a weekday night in February 2023, the park was packed for the evening light show, but with both tourists and locals. And it's this part you don't have to pay for. And it's quite, I have no idea why I coughed up money for this silly photo, but I did, I confess. But again, it's to get into the kind of tourist thing that is supposed to define Singapore. Although we hear that these super trees are designed to collect rainwater for fountains and irrigation, and the claim is that they power the evening light shows through these photovoltaic panels on the super trees, not everyone is convinced of the eco-friendliness of these structures. Which are the eco-friendly part of it. There's tons of like little plaques on the bottom of the super trees, but I'm the only person I've seen actually reading them. And they make this claim that these super trees are really ecologically sound, but I couldn't quite understand how that would work. And even those who consider Gardens by the Bay a key part of Singapore's commitment to greening the city, note that the form and scale of their greenhouses were guzzlers of energy, no matter what eco-friendly claims they made. And no one actually asserted that they were ecologically sound, although that question was often answered with a snort. One of the more trenchant, if subtle, critiques came from a scholar who ran walking tours in Bukit Brown Cemetery, which is another part of Singapore sort of caught in this triangle between cultural heritage preservation, the need for more housing, and highway development. And so part of this cemetery was destroyed for a highway, but activists are trying to make sure that the rest of the cemetery doesn't get completely demolished. After the tour, I took a bus to the MRT with the leader of the tour and a grad student. We got into a discussion about the Gardens by the Bay, which caused their eyes to roll. The tour guide mentions that when he runs tours only for Singaporeans, he always leaves them standing in the hot sun for about 10 minutes and then moves them under one of the natural super trees, which do provide shade. On our tour, when we moved into this deeply appreciated shade, he pointed out, and we don't even have to pay for these beautiful trees. This tour guide was one of the Singaporeans who thought that resources would have been better spent on preserving the natural trees and the cultural heritage surrounding them, rather than creating fake trees as a spectacle. And the grad student bitterly noted that many of them would like to see more government funding for their projects, sounding very much like grad students at home as well. But my interlocutor from the Botanic Gardens lapped up all of this negative commentary and laughed at it, but said despite the expense of the Supertrees, they do define Singapore and attract a lot of visitors and have inspired less extravagant imitations in Cambodia and Vietnam. As Juan Leo suggests, the gardens by the bay represent the inherent manufactured nature of a particular brand of New Asian tropicality in Singapore. So the next session is called Disneyland with the Death Penalty. To go back to the Bukit Brown, these are some of the completely unregulated plant growth in the cemetery. So it's kind of abandoned, but he highlights how you see actual nature here rather than curated nature. So, Disneyland with the death penalty. One does wonder what sci-fi writer William Gibson would make of Gardens by the Bay. His searing article entitled Welcome to Disneyland with the Death Penalty was published in Wired magazine in 1993. The byline under the title said, Wired sent William Gibson to Singapore to see whether that clean dystopia represents our techno future. Gibson is a sci-fi writer at the center of the cyberpunk genre. He is originally American, but came to Canada to escape the Vietnam War draft. So he's a Canadian draft dodger who has converted to becoming a Canadian, which is not what he's famous for. It's rather the cyberpunk genre. So he's at the center of the cyberpunk genre, envisioning a dystopian future where high tech has not, by any means, ensured relief for decaying society. According to Wikipedia, he is credited by many for making science fiction cool again. And the movies Blade Runner and The Matrix are of this genre. Disneyland with the Death Penalty was his first nonfiction piece in the second year of Wired's existence. And in some ways, this article also put Singapore on the map, especially as the Singapore government responded by briefly banning Wired. And the title itself came to represent Singapore abroad. And the death penalty that he was particularly concerned about was the death penalty that is given to anyone caught smuggling drugs, from marijuana to heroin, which generated a lot of criticism. The Singaporean author Hong Peng Wei, writing in 2023 on the 30-year anniversary of Gibson's famous article, notes that this article surely impressed a great many readers who had never set foot in Singapore ever. Even Wei, though, has to admit that Gardens by the Bay, a $1 billion horticultural fantasy complete with artificial Supertrees, would seem to confirm Gibson's diagnosis of engineered perfection taken to new heights. Jareen Tan, a Singaporean living and working in the US, wrote a response to Gibson's article again published in Wired in 2020. It is not without a bit of sadness that she fears he may have been right about a clear dystopia. But she also suggests that he was wrong. Singapore does have a much more complicated past and present, with the potential to exceed its possibilities. She argues, Singapore's self-conception shares the paradox of cyberpunk, embracing both the traditional and the postmodern. We supplicate at the feet of our colonial past. At the same time, we believe ourselves autochthonous, springing out of the ground from dragon's teeth, as in the Greek myth, self-made and therefore without past. However, she suggests that, in fact, the real argument is a question that extends far beyond Singapore. What price are we willing to pay for order and prosperity? Were they criticizing Singapore, or were there parables about modernity itself, particularly capitalist modernity? The truth is, Singapore represents our collective ambivalence about technology, order, and freedom, the desire for frictionless efficiency alongside the human need for messy authenticity. Although Gibson and others have denigrated Singapore as boring, I am persuaded by Dan Vissel's observation that being boring may be an achievement that at least some Singaporeans are proud of. The water is safe, the streets are safe, it's not difficult to make your way around the city. Others, including this anthropologist, conclude that Singapore is only boring if you don't look very hard and don't talk to local Singaporeans. And as Tan notes, Singapore has always existed as a palimpsest, a gaudy collection of gauzy histories layered so heavily that a single origin seems beyond reach. I would like to move now to ordinary acts of greening. The gardens by the bay get so much attention, but the ordinary greening of the city is also noteworthy, as they can exploit Singapore's consistently warm temperature. There are some notable examples of greening in terms of everyday architecture. So I'm just going to give you a few quick examples here. This is the Park Royal Pickering Hotel, which I think is quite astounding. And in fact, Singapore is known to encourage greening with tax incentives, common enough in other countries, certainly in Canada. And if you do enough greening, you also get permission to build extra floors in your high-rise. And as Singapore moved from being a garden city to a city in nature, many corporations took advantage of Singapore's granting tax relief to buildings with green spaces. So the Capita Spring building in the center of the business district has an open-air garden space between the 14th and the 17th floor, and a rooftop garden that supplies the fancy restaurant on the 50th floor with fresh vegetables. This is the interior part. The view from the top is touted by many as providing a far superior view of Singapore, and it is free as long as you sign up in time. And rather than paying $14 for the Singapore Observatory, many people choose this option. The middle garden space I thought was quite charming, really, for it's the space for office workers to enjoy their lunch, take a yoga class, or just commune with plants. So that's the view looking out. This, of course, is not possible in Canada because the winter is too cold to make this possible. So you can just hang out. No, that's another one. Hang out and admire the view. And so no tourists can come between 10:30 and 2:30 as it's reserved for the office residents and the hotel that's also in the building. In an evaluation of Singapore's green mark scheme over the past 2 decades, Han argues, for instance, Singapore's based CapitaLand, Southeast Asia's largest developer, says investments in green building technologies have helped the company reduce 11% and 16% of its energy and water consumption, respectively, since 2008. The greening goes well beyond gardens and other parks, although the parks themselves have expanded since independence, and there's a move to develop connectors, green spaces, walking and bike paths that connect the various parks. Some hospitals also have intense greenery inside to help with patient recovery. It is another example of Singapore taking advantage of the natural resource they do have, which is consistent weather. The other thing I loved about this is a minor point, but in many of the bathrooms, you have open air bathrooms so you can wash your hands by while looking at the plants. This is from the Botanic Gardens. This is just kind of ordinary gardening, so this is not government structured. This is from the ground up in various apartment flats. They grow have their own little gardens. There's also edible gardens, community gardens, and this is a building at Nanyang University, which is very photogenic. Marina Bay 1 is one of the properties which belonged to the railway that was jointly owned by Malaysia and Singapore. Now they have opened this huge, massive development, which includes private apartments, serviced apartments, and businesses with an amazing green courtyard that's open to all. And airports. Changi Airport. While I'm not a Singapore basher, I have to admit that I am puzzled by Singapore's advertisement of its plant-forward Changi Airport as a destination site to visit in and of itself. I'm kind of with Marc Auger on this point, that where he describes airports as non-places. People use the airports, these non-places, to go from point A to point B. So they're kind of betwixt and between spaces in Victor Turner's sense. I have always evaluated airports in terms of how easy it is to transit through them. As I said to Katie when I met her, she told me Frankfurt was really nice, but since my only experience of Frankfurt was the airport, it was far from my favorite experience. I just want straightforward and efficient. It's nice to have a clean and aesthetically pleasing airport like Oslo's airport. Gardermoen comes to mind. But my prime directive is to move through the airport. Singapore mixes up Marc Auger's idea of the non-place by touting Changi Airport as a place itself. Like many contemporary airports, of course, it has bountiful shopping opportunities. But what makes it stand out are its gardens. And as in the cloud forest at Gardens by the Bay, Changi Airport features a very high waterfall. In the interests of being a good anthropologist, I went to Changi Airport several hours early for a midnight flight back to Toronto. It certainly is spectacular, and several people noted to me that it was a good space for a long layover. But as a destination itself, once was enough for this anthropologist. Like the cloud forest, my sense was that it would be perfect if you had a rambunctious 2-year-old in need of distraction, and this particular display in the airport, the panda display, provides distraction for the young kids. As Tan points out, Changi Airport does live up to Lee Kuan Yew's imagined Singapore as clean, green, and importantly, safe for business. And she argues that this fantasy has been literalized in Jewel Changi. The clunkily named natural features like the waterfall are HSBC rain vortex, and the forest, Shiseido Forest Valley, are named after their corporate sponsors. Okay, let me wind up here, sorry. Although all gardens have some human intervention and planning and care, few have gained as much attention, both positive and negative, as Singapore's Gardens by the Bay. They certainly are unforgettable, but unforgettable can be both good and bad. And few gardens celebrate the artificiality of the garden with such enthusiasm as do Gardens by the Bay. It certainly has provoked much criticism, particularly from those who appreciate the ease of living in Singapore while condemning it as an authoritarian state. And I have heard many loudly proclaim that Singapore is a dictatorship at the top of their lungs in a public space, which in dictatorships that I have experience with, you would be carted off for saying such a thing. But as Yi Shengning notes, dwelling on the atrocity of Gardens by the Bay is starting to seem a little cliche. Some Singaporeans do not get excited about it one way or the other, but do not go there unless they have guests visiting from out of town, like New Yorkers might do with the Empire State Building, or Parisians with the Eiffel Tower, or Torontonians with the CN Tower. However, fans of Gardens by the Bay might also relish Singapore's early history of theme parks. The now defunct New World theme park and Hau Par Villa, funded by the, that's more Changi, this was funded by the inventor of Tiger Bomb, and it is still in operation despite being founded in 1937, and it even has an MRT stop named after it. Discussing the new Singaporean authors who play with Singapore's colonial heritage and its fantasy future, including Yi Shengning, who I discussed last time, Liao suggests, in these new Asian tropicalities, elements of neo-colonial control and anti-colonial rebellion, capitalist spectacle and spectrality, are not opposed in any simple binary way. Instead, like creeping plants, epiphytes and bromeliads that twine themselves on the steel and concrete skeletons of the Supertrees, and the ongoing battle to keep the cooled conservatories sealed off from the tropical exterior, plant life, climate, and human endeavor are locked in a seemingly constant struggle for dominance. Thank you.